The faded yellow light of the kitchen bulb flickered over a mountain of past-due notices. Arthur stared at the final eviction warning, his calloused hands trembling just enough to rattle the cold cup of black coffee resting on the scarred wooden table. The silence in that cramped, dusty room was heavy, suffocating, broken only by the ticking of a cheap wall clock that seemed to count down the last remnants of his dignity. At 72 years old, after a lifetime of honest labor and a tour in a jungle war that still haunted his nights, this was what it came down to. He folded the thick, unforgiving paper, slipped it into the breast pocket of his faded yellow stadium staff uniform, and walked out into the sweltering Texas heat. He had a shift to work. He had to survive. 70,000 souls packed into the colossal open-air arena that night. The summer heat still radiated from the poured concrete, mixing heavily with the scent of raw leather, spilled draft beer, and the dry dust kicked up by thousands of stomping boots. Up on the massive stage, the undisputed king of country stood as a beacon of quiet authority. George Strait wore perfectly starched Wrangler jeans, a crisp button-down shirt, and his signature cowboy hat, pulled just low enough to shield his eyes from the blinding spotlights. He strummed his acoustic guitar, his calm, steady voice rolling over the crowd like a warm southern breeze. It was a sacred communion between a man and his people. The crowd absorbed every chord with pure devotion, finding solace in the honest lyrics that spoke of hard work, open plains, and enduring faith. But down in the shadows of the barricades, right at the edge of the stage, that communion was about to be violently shattered. Arthur stood at his post in the premium VIP pit. His worn-out work boots ached against the hard floor, his knees protesting every minute he remained standing. His job was simple but exhausting, keeping the emergency aisles clear and making sure the high-paying attendees stayed safe. A few feet away stood a group of men who did not belong in this world of calluses and pickup trucks. They were city slickers, corporate executives dressed in imported designer suits unbuttoned at the collar, flashing heavy gold watches that cost more than Arthur had earned in a decade of sweeping floors and directing crowds. They were loud, belligerent, and completely ignoring the music. To them, this was not a concert. It was a display of wealth, a place to be seen, a playground where they believed their money made them untouchable. The leader of the group, a tall man with a flushed face, expensive cologne, and a cruel sneer, kept stumbling into the designated fire lane. He held a glass of premium whiskey, sloshing the amber liquid onto the floor and occasionally onto the boots of the people trying to enjoy the show around him. He laughed obnoxiously, turning his back to the stage, treating the sacred ground of a Texas country show like his own private tavern. Arthur took a deep breath, his chest tight, with the anxiety of a man who knew he could not afford to lose his minimum wage job. The eviction notice in his pocket felt like a lead weight against his heart. He stepped forward, tipping his head respectfully, his voice soft and polite, carrying the humble grace of a generation that knew the value of manners. He asked the executive to please step back behind the yellow painted line, explaining that the fire marshal required the aisle to remain clear. The executive stopped laughing. He turned slowly, his cold, arrogant eyes scanning Arthur from his thinning gray hair down to his scuffed duct-taped boots. A look of absolute disgust twisted the wealthy man's features. He saw nothing but an obstacle, a peasant daring to speak to a king. The executive puffed out his chest, stepping aggressively into Arthur's personal space, the smell of alcohol and entitlement rolling off him in waves. Up on the stage, the band had just reached a planned, dramatic pause. It was the quiet breath before the acoustic intro of Amarillo by Morning, a moment where the entire stadium traditionally fell into a hushed, reverent silence. In that split second of absolute arena-wide quiet, the executive shoved Arthur hard in the shoulder. The old man stumbled backward, his fragile frame hitting the cold steel of the barricade with a hollow thud. Then, the executive roared, his voice bouncing off the concrete and bleeding directly into the ambient microphones positioned at the edge of the stage. "Get out of my face, you piece of trash. I paid $10,000 for this spot. You are a nobody, and you do not give me orders." The vicious words echoed through the massive stadium speakers. The sheer cruelty of the insult hung in the humid air, freezing the blood of everyone within earshot. The executive laughed, turning to his friends who joined in the mockery, pointing at Arthur's trembling frame. The old veteran shrank against the metal railing, his face flushed with a deep, agonizing shame. He lowered his eyes to the floor, apologizing repeatedly, his voice cracking as he desperately tried to blend into the shadows. He felt the terrifying grip of panic, certain that his supervisor would rush over and fire him on the spot. He thought of the bills on his kitchen table, the empty refrigerator, the crushing weight of a world that seemed to have no place for an old, tired man. The surrounding crowd began to murmur. A dark, simmering anger rippled through the front rows, but no one moved. The paralyzing shock of the executive's aggressive wealth and the sudden violence of the moment kept them rooted to their spots. Arthur felt a tear of pure humiliation burn the corner of his eye. He was reduced to nothing, stripped of his humanity by a man who believed dignity could be bought and sold. He closed his eyes, waiting for the ground to swallow him whole. But up on the stage, the acoustic intro never began. The music died completely. George Strait slowly lowered his guitar. The stadium plunged into a deafening, terrifying silence. The king of country stood perfectly still under the solitary beam of a white spotlight. His face was stoic, an unreadable mask of Texas granite. He did not yell. He did not throw a tantrum. But his eyes narrowed under the brim of his hat, locked onto the scene below with a piercing intensity that promised an immediate reckoning. The air in the stadium grew thick, heavy with the electric tension of a gathering storm. 70,000 people held their breath. The show had stopped, and the judgment was about to begin. The echo of that vicious insult hung over the stadium like a dark, suffocating cloud, refusing to dissipate into the sweltering Texas night. The sheer volume of the executive's voice, amplified by the ambient microphones meant to capture the joy of the crowd, had turned a private moment of bullying into a public execution of an old man's dignity. Down in the VIP pit, time seemed to grind to an agonizing halt. The air grew incredibly thick, smelling of spilled whiskey, expensive cologne, and the metallic tang of fear. Arthur stood frozen against the cold steel barricade. His breathing was shallow and ragged. Every instinct he had honed over 72 years of a hard, honest life screamed at him to stand tall, to defend his honor, to look this arrogant stranger in the eye and demand the respect he had earned. He had survived the suffocating jungles of Vietnam, carrying wounded brothers on his back through the mud and the blood. He had worked 30 years in a dusty lumber yard, breaking his back to provide for a wife who had passed away too soon and a family that had slowly drifted apart. He was a man who knew the value of a hard day of labor, a man who paid his taxes, went to church on Sundays, and bowed his head in gratitude for the meager meals on his table. But right now, in the blinding glare of the stage lights, he felt entirely powerless. He felt the crinkled paper of the eviction notice burning like a hot coal against his chest through the thin fabric of his yellow stadium staff shirt. That piece of paper was a cruel reminder of his vulnerability. If he lost this job tonight, he would lose the roof over his head. He would be out on the unforgiving streets of San Antonio. The fear of destitution paralyzed him. He lowered his gaze to the concrete floor, staring at his own worn-out duct-taped boots. He swallowed the bitter taste of humiliation, his shoulders slumping under the invisible weight of his poverty. He began to apologize, his voice trembling, a cracked whisper that barely escaped his throat. He mumbled that he was just doing his job, that he meant no disrespect, desperately trying to de-escalate the situation and fade back into the shadows of the barricade. But the executive was not satisfied with just pushing an old man out of his way. He wanted a spectacle. He wanted to assert his dominance in a room full of people he considered beneath him. The wealthy man adjusted the cuffs of his imported silk shirt, the heavy gold and diamond watch on his wrist, catching the blinding white light of the stage and reflecting it like a mocking beacon. He turned to his group of friends, a circle of equally arrogant men in tailored suits who were treating the country music concert like an exotic safari. They erupted into cruel, mocking laughter. "Look at him," the executive sneered, pointing a manicured finger at Arthur's trembling frame. "The man cannot even afford a decent pair of shoes, and he thinks he has the right to tell me where to stand. I drop more money on a dinner in New York than this fossil makes in a year." The cruelty of the words was a physical blow. Arthur closed his eyes, praying for the ground to open up and swallow him. The surrounding crowd, the genuine fans who had saved up for months to buy their tickets, began to shift uneasily. A low, dangerous murmur rippled through the front rows. A burly rancher in a faded plaid shirt and a dusty Stetson clenched his large, calloused fists, taking a half-step forward. But his wife, her eyes wide with apprehension, grabbed his forearm and pulled him back. The executive reeked of aggressive wealth and litigious power. In the modern world, men like that destroyed lives with a single phone call to a lawyer or a complaint to a stadium manager. The crowd was paralyzed by the toxic bubble of privilege that surrounded the VIP section, trapped between their burning outrage and the cold, hard reality of how the world usually worked. Up on the massive wooden stage, the atmosphere had shifted from a warm, communal celebration to a chilling, electric tension. The band, a group of seasoned Texas musicians who had played thousands of shows, sensed the sudden change in the air. The steel guitar player, who had been resting his hands over his instrument, froze entirely. The drummer lowered his sticks, his eyes darting toward the center spotlight. The fiddle player stepped back into the shadows. They all looked at the man standing center stage. George Strait had not moved a muscle. He stood perfectly still, his tall, broad-shouldered frame casting a long, dark shadow across the wooden floorboards. The stadium was dead quiet now, the silence so profound that the distant rumble of a freight train miles away could be heard echoing through the night. The only other sound was the faint electric hum of the massive amplifiers flanking the stage. George slowly lowered his acoustic guitar, his large hands resting against the polished wood of the instrument. His face, usually so warm and welcoming, was carved from stone. He was a man who embodied the old codes of the West, a man who believed that you tip your hat to a lady, you say please and thank you, and you never under any circumstances mistreat someone who is working hard to serve you. Under the brim of his perfectly shaped cowboy hat, his eyes narrowed. He did not show a flash of hot, uncontrollable rage. That was not his way. His anger was cold, deliberate, and terrifyingly focused. It was the quiet, immovable resolve of a man who had drawn a line in the sand and was watching someone step over it. He looked down into the VIP pit, staring directly at the executive who was still chuckling with his friends, completely oblivious to the massive storm gathering right above his head. The tension stretched out for what felt like hours. 70,000 people held their breath, their eyes darting between the arrogant millionaire in the pit and the stoic cowboy on the stage. Then George moved. It was a simple gesture, but it carried the weight of a tectonic shift. He raised his right hand, lifting a single finger in the direction of his band. It was a silent, absolute command. The music is over. The show is stopping. He reached down and grasped the thick black cable plugged into his acoustic guitar. With a firm pull, he disconnected it. The loud pop of the cable leaving the jack echoed through the stadium speakers like a thunderclap, making the executive jump and spill a few drops of his premium whiskey onto the concrete. George handed the guitar to a stagehand who had materialized from the darkness, his face pale with anticipation. Armed only with his wireless microphone, George turned and began to walk toward the front edge of the stage. His movements were slow, heavy, and deliberate. The sound of his leather boots striking the wooden floorboards resonated through the arena, a steady, rhythmic march that sounded like the ticking of a clock running out of time. Step by step, he closed the distance. The blinding spotlights followed him, cutting through the dusty Texas air. He stopped right at the very edge of the stage, his boots resting just inches from the drop-off. He was standing directly above the executive and the trembling old man. The physical height difference made George look like an imposing titan of justice, looking down upon a petty, insignificant tyrant. The executive finally looked up, his cruel smile faltering as he met the cold, unwavering gaze of the Texas legend. The millionaire tried to puff out his chest again, trying to project the same arrogance he used to intimidate his corporate rivals. But under the crushing weight of George's stare, he suddenly looked very small. George did not shout. He did not curse. He slowly crouched down, resting one forearm on his knee, bringing his face closer to the VIP pit. His shadow fell completely over the executive, enveloping him in darkness. The stadium was so quiet, you could hear the Texas wind rustling the flags above the bleachers. George brought the microphone to his lips. When he spoke, his voice was incredibly deep, calm and steeped in a lethal, traditional Southern politeness that sent shivers down the spine of every person in the arena. "Excuse me, sir." The words rolled out of the massive speakers, smooth but heavy as iron. "Would you mind repeating what you just said to this gentleman?" The microphone captured the deep, resonant timbre of George Strait's voice, projecting it across the vast expanse of the stadium like the rumble of an approaching storm. The words were polite, steeped in the traditional manners of a true Southern gentleman, but they carried the devastating weight of an absolute ultimatum. "Would you mind repeating what you just said to this gentleman?" The question hung in the thick, humid air, echoing off the concrete tiers and the steel beams of the arena. 70,000 people leaned forward in the dark, their collective breath held in a state of suspended animation. The blinding white spotlight remained fixed on the stoic cowboy crouching at the edge of the stage, his shadow completely swallowing the arrogant executive in the VIP pit below. The wealthy city slicker, who just moments before had felt like the undisputed king of his purchased domain, suddenly found himself trapped in a nightmare of his own making. The cruel, mocking smile melted from his flushed face, replaced by a pale, sickly mask of sudden terror. He looked to his right and left, desperately seeking the support of his tailored friends, but they had all instinctively taken a step back, abandoning him to the blinding glare of the spotlight and the crushing scrutiny of the Texas legend. The executive opened his mouth to speak, but his throat had gone completely dry. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing above the collar of his expensive imported shirt. The heavy gold watch on his wrist suddenly felt like a shackle. I just... The executive stammered, his voice thin and trembling, completely stripped of its former venom. "I paid $10,000 for this premium access. I bought these tickets. I have the right to stand where I want. He works for the stadium. He should know his place." The justification was pathetic, a desperate cling to the only power he understood, the power of a bank account. A low, collective groan of disgust rippled through the front rows of the crowd. The genuine fans, the ranchers, the nurses, the mechanics, and the teachers who had saved their hard-earned money to be there, felt their blood boil at the sheer audacity of the man's entitlement. But nobody shouted. Nobody threw a cup. They all deferred to the man on the stage, trusting the cowboy to handle the trespasser in his own house. George Strait did not blink. He did not raise his voice to match the executive's panic. He slowly stood up, his tall, broad-shouldered frame rising like a monument against the backdrop of the massive stage rigging. He adjusted the brim of his hat with a calm, deliberate motion, his eyes never leaving the trembling millionaire. When he brought the microphone back to his lips, his voice was a masterclass in controlled, righteous authority. "Son," George began, the single word cutting through the tension like a sharp blade. "Out here, we do not measure a man by the size of his wallet or the price tag on his clothes. On this stage and in this crowd, we celebrate the man who works hard. We celebrate the man who breaks his back to put food on the table, who serves his country, and who treats his neighbors with the respect God intended." George took a slow, deliberate step along the edge of the stage, his boots echoing heavily. He pointed a long, steady finger down at Arthur, the elderly veteran who was still pressing himself against the cold steel barricade, his eyes wide with disbelief. "You look at this gentleman right here," George continued, his voice echoing with a profound, unshakable reverence. "You look at his hands. You look at his uniform. The boots on this man's feet have walked through more honest days, through more sacrifice and hard labor than your designer shoes will ever see in a lifetime. You think your money buys you the right to strip away another man's dignity, but all your money just did was prove to 70,000 people that you are entirely bankrupt of character." The stadium erupted into a deafening roar of approval, a tidal wave of sound that shook the very foundations of the concrete arena. It was not just a cheer for a beloved singer, it was a primal collective cry for justice. The working-class heart of Texas beat in unison, a thunderous validation of the values that built the country. The executive physically shrank under the overwhelming wall of sound, his face burning with a humiliation so profound he could barely keep his eyes open. He was completely exposed, stripped of his artificial armor, reduced to a small, petty bully standing in the blinding light of truth. George raised his hand, and the stadium instantly fell back into a hushed, respectful silence. The command he held over the massive crowd was absolute. He reached to his leather belt and unclipped a small black radio, bringing it up to his mouth. The stadium speakers picked up the faint click of the transmission. "Yes, sir." "No, ma'am," George spoke into the radio, his tone returning to the polite, businesslike drawl of a rancher, giving instructions to his ranch hands. "I need my personal security team down here at the front barricade, right side. Please escort this young man and his friends to the nearest exit. Ensure they are safely removed from the premises, and go to the box office. Refund every single penny they spent tonight." George lowered the radio, looking dead into the eyes of the shattered executive. "Your money is not welcome here." The eruption that followed was tectonic. The stands shook as 70,000 people stomped their boots against the concrete, whistling, cheering, and throwing their hats into the air. A squad of massive, broad-shouldered security guards in black shirts materialized from the shadows of the barricades like avenging angels. They did not touch the executives with malice, but their presence was an immovable force. With stern professional efficiency, they formed a wall around the disgraced millionaires and pointed toward the long, dark tunnel leading out of the stadium. The walk of shame was absolute. The executive, his head bowed, his expensive suit suddenly looking like a clown costume, was marched down the aisle alongside his silent, terrified friends. The crowd parted for them, not out of respect, but out of disgust, letting them pass through a gauntlet of stern glares and righteous boos. The toxic bubble of privilege had been violently popped, leaving nothing but the cold, hard reality of consequence. They were cast out into the sweltering Texas night, expelled from the communion of decent folks. As the commotion of the ejection faded into the tunnels, the atmosphere inside the stadium underwent a miraculous purification. The air felt lighter, cleaner, as if a heavy, suffocating humidity had finally broken to reveal a clear, star-filled sky. But George Strait was not finished. The punishment of the wicked was only half the equation. The restoration of the righteous was the true measure of a man's faith. George walked back to the very edge of the stage, right above where Arthur was still standing. The old man was trembling, his chest heaving, his eyes overflowing with hot, stinging tears. He had spent his entire life feeling invisible, a ghost sweeping the floors of a world that had moved on without him. He had accepted the daily humiliations, the aching joints, the crushing anxiety of the yellow eviction notice burning in his breast pocket. But tonight, the king of country had stopped the world just to defend his name. George crouched down once more, reaching his large, calloused hand over the drop-off. He looked at Arthur not with pity, but with a deep, fraternal respect. "Come on up here, partner," George said softly, his voice carrying only to the front rows. "You have been standing long enough." Arthur hesitated, his hands shaking as he wiped the tears from his deeply lined face. A young stadium supervisor, who had rushed over during the commotion, gently placed a hand on Arthur's shoulder and nodded, silently granting him permission to leave his post. With a trembling breath, Arthur reached up and grasped George's outstretched hand. The grip was firm, warm, and infused with an unspoken promise of brotherhood. With a gentle pull, George helped the old man navigate around the steel barricade. George did not just leave Arthur in the pit. He guided the elderly veteran directly to the plush, velvet-lined premium seats in the front row, the exact seats that had just been forcibly vacated by the arrogant executives. "These are yours for the rest of the night," George said, tipping his hat to the old man. "You sit down, you rest those boots. Tonight, you are my guest of honor." Arthur sank into the incredibly soft, luxurious seat. The physical relief in his aching legs was immediate, but it was nothing compared to the overwhelming emotional release that washed over his soul. He buried his face in his rough, calloused hands and wept. He cried for the years of silent struggle, for the disrespect he had swallowed, for the fear of losing his home, and for the sheer, unbelievable grace of this single moment. The crowd around him, the same people who had been paralyzed by the executive's wealth just minutes before, now rallied around the old man. A rancher patted him gently on the back. A woman with kind eyes handed him a clean tissue. He was no longer a faceless employee in a faded yellow shirt. He was a respected elder, surrounded by a community that recognized his worth. Up on the stage, George Strait walked slowly back to the center microphone. He picked up his acoustic guitar from the waiting stagehand and plugged the thick black cable back into the jack. The familiar, comforting hum of the amplifiers returned to the stadium. George adjusted the strap over his shoulder, his face softening into the warm, familiar expression that millions of fans had loved for decades. He looked out over the sea of faces, his eyes finally resting on Arthur, who was sitting tall in the front row, a profound sense of peace settling over his weary features. "This world can be a tough place," George spoke into the microphone, his voice rolling over the crowd like a soothing balm. "Sometimes it feels like the dust just keeps blowing, and the rain is never going to come. But as long as we remember to look out for one another, as long as we remember that every honest day of work is a badge of honor, we are going to be just fine." "This next song goes out to my new friend, sitting right down here in the front row." George raised his hand, and this time the band responded with a swell of beautiful, sweeping music. The mournful, sweet cry of the fiddle cut through the night air, followed by the steady, heartbeat rhythm of the bass and the gentle strum of the acoustic guitar. It was a hymn to the working man, a ballad about riding through the storms and finding grace in the dirt and the sweat of a life well lived. As George sang, the words seemed to wrap around the stadium like a protective blanket. The smell of the Texas dust mixed with the faint metallic scent of an approaching summer rain, a cleansing shower that promised to wash away the bitterness of the evening. Arthur sat in his premium seat, closing his eyes, letting the music fill the empty, frightened spaces in his heart. For the first time in a very long time, he felt entirely safe. He felt seen. The rest of the concert was nothing short of legendary. The energy in the stadium had been transformed into something sacred, a collective celebration of decency and mutual respect. When the final chord rang out and the stage lights faded to black, the crowd did not rush the exits. They lingered, savoring the feeling of a community united by a shared sense of justice. As Arthur finally stood up to leave, the people around him shook his hand, thanking him for his service, treating him with the dignity he had always deserved. The aftermath of that sweltering Texas night rippled far beyond the concrete walls of the stadium. In the modern age, secrets do not exist, and justice is rarely confined to a single room. Dozens of cell phones had captured the entire confrontation from the grandstands. By the time the sun rose over the dusty plains the next morning, the video of George Strait stopping his concert to defend an elderly janitor had spread like wildfire across the country. It did not circulate as cheap celebrity gossip or a scandalous tabloid headline. It moved as a powerful, undeniable sermon on morality. It was shared by grandfathers, by factory workers, by teachers, and by pastors. It became a cultural touchstone, a stark reminder that true power does not roar from a boardroom, but speaks quietly and firmly from a place of deep, unshakable values. The arrogant executive returned to his corporate high-rise, but the digital footprint of his cruelty followed him. He became a pariah in his own circles, his reputation shattered by the undeniable footage of his own arrogance. He learned the hard way that all the imported suits and diamond watches in the world could not shield him from the consequences of a rotten character. But the true miracle of that night belonged to Arthur. The morning after the concert, he sat at his scarred wooden kitchen table. The faded yellow light bulb still flickered overhead, but the room no longer felt like a suffocating prison. He reached into the breast pocket of his work shirt and pulled out the crumpled eviction notice. He stared at the unforgiving numbers, the threat of losing his home still a harsh reality, despite the emotional triumph of the previous night. He sighed, rubbing his tired eyes, wondering how he was going to survive the coming week. Then there was a sharp knock at his front door. Arthur slowly pushed himself up from the table, his joints popping, and walked to the door. When he opened it, he did not find a landlord or a collection agent. He found the stadium manager, a usually gruff and busy man, standing on his porch with his hat in his hands and a thick white envelope tucked under his arm. Behind him, parked at the curb, was a sleek black town car that looked entirely out of place in Arthur's rundown neighborhood. The manager cleared his throat, looking at Arthur with a newfound reverence. "Arthur," he began, his voice surprisingly gentle. "The front office got a call this morning. It was from Mr. Strait's management team over in San Antonio." Arthur's heart skipped a beat. He gripped the doorframe, suddenly terrified that he had somehow caused a problem for the stadium, that the destruction of the VIP section had come back to haunt him. "They wanted to make sure you were all right," the manager continued, handing the thick white envelope to the old man. "And they wanted to deliver this personally." Arthur took the envelope. It was heavy, made of thick, expensive paper. His trembling fingers broke the wax seal on the back. Inside, he did not find cash. He found a legal document from his property management company, stamped heavily in red ink, paid in full. Attached to it was a handwritten note on heavy cardstock, bearing the embossed initials GS at the top. The handwriting was neat, slanted, and deliberate. "A man who has walked as many miles as you have deserves to rest his boots under his own roof. Thank you for your hard work. God bless." Arthur stared at the letter, his vision blurring as fresh tears welled up in his eyes. The crushing, suffocating weight that had rested on his chest for months completely vanished, evaporating into the warm morning air. He was not going to be thrown out into the streets. He was safe. The quiet, respectful intervention was the ultimate testament to the cowboy's character. George Strait had not made a public spectacle of his charity. He had not called the press or boasted about his generosity. He simply saw a neighbor in need, a man who had been pushed to the edge of the abyss, and he quietly, firmly pulled him back onto solid ground. In the weeks and months that followed, Arthur's life transformed. He continued to work at the stadium, not because he was desperate for the meager paycheck to survive, but because it gave him purpose. He walked the concrete concourses with his head held high, his shoulders pulled back. The duct-taped boots were gone, replaced by a brand new pair of sturdy, comfortable leather work boots, a gift from the stadium staff who had pooled their money together to honor him. Every time he walked past the VIP section, the regular fans would tip their hats to him. He was no longer just the old man sweeping the floors. He was a symbol of resilience, a living reminder of the night the king of country proved that decency and respect are the true currencies of a life well lived. The Texas sun continued to beat down on the dusty roads, and the summer storms continued to roll across the plains, washing the earth clean. The world kept spinning, full of its usual hardships and struggles. But in that small corner of the universe, a profound truth had been permanently etched into the hearts of everyone who witnessed it. They learned that dignity cannot be bought with a $10,000 ticket, and honor cannot be worn like a designer suit. They learned that true strength is found in the quiet courage to stand up for the vulnerable, in the polite but unyielding refusal to let cruelty win, and in the deep, abiding faith that when the dust finally settles, the hard-working man will always find his rightful place in the light.